The library is so pleased to be collaborating with the Wellesley League of Women Voters to bring tonight's program, as community partnerships are fundamental to the library's mission. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Friends of the Wellesley Free Libraries, a supporting organization that allows the library to offer many free cultural and educational programs for all ages year-round. Thank you to all. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Barbara Berenson. A graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, Barbara works as a senior attorney at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. She is the author of Massachusetts in the Woman Suffrage Movement, Revolutionary Reformers, Boston in the Civil War, Hub of the Second Revolution, and Walking Tours of Civil War Boston, Hub of Abolitionism. She is also the co-editor of Breaking Barriers, the unfinished story of women lawyers and judges in Massachusetts. Barbara serves on the boards of Boston by Foot and the Royal House and Slave Quarters. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Berenson. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kathy, to the Friends of the Wellesley Library and to the League of Women Voters. It's a particular pleasure to get to thank the League of Women Voters, of course, because the League of Women Voters, at the same time as we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020, we will also be celebrating the 100th birthday of the League of Women Voters. And we'll have a picture that will show this at the end, but the National American Woman Suffrage Association, an organization we'll be talking a great deal about tonight, renamed itself as the suffrage battle was finally coming to a close. And the new name of the National American Woman Suffrage Association is the League of Women Voters. So how many of you are past or present League supporters, members? So that is wonderful. I also should particularly thank my dear friend who's sitting in the front row, who's Marlena Raycamp O'Brien, who has been very active in both the Massachusetts, in all of the Massachusetts, Wellesley, and National League of Women Voters, and who I thank in my acknowledgments. So if you are inclined to buy a copy of the book at the end of the evening, you will actually get to see also Marlena's name thanked there as a wonderful friend and supporter. We're also in the same book group. The other thing I want to mention as I get started is there'll be time for questions and answers at the end and also comments. And I know that some of you may have stories that you've heard from mothers, grandmothers, great aunts, whatever it may be, of their personal involvements with the women's suffrage movement or other important endeavors related to women's rights in this time frame. And so I'd love to hear from you at the end. Most importantly, of course, is that you can hear fine. So if at any point that's an issue, please, please let me know. So I'm going to begin by explaining quickly why I decided to write this book, and then we're going to launch into the women's suffrage story. One of the things that led me to write this book was this monument in the United States Capitol that some of you may have seen on visits to Washington, D.C. And it is the Suffrage Monument and depicts three very important women in the suffrage story. They are Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. But when I look at it, I think to myself and thought to myself, yes, that's wonderful. Those three women are very important and worthy of being included in the statute. But where's everybody else? And most particularly, where is my favorite Lucy Stone and her daughter Alice Stone Blackwell? And of course, they're not there. And the reason they're not there is one of the things that I explore in my book. So what I want to do tonight and what I do in the book is to tell you somewhat of the complete story of suffrage, with a particular focus on the very important local Massachusetts story, and also talk about why this story has been obscured from view for so long. I can't do all of that tonight, so what I'll do tonight is focus on key episodes, but I will try to have key episodes that will take us from the beginning to victory at the end in under an hour. The first thing we're going to do is talk about where to start. Now, if there's one thing that I bet everybody here knows about the women's suffrage movement, it's something like this, a sentence that you read in your own history books, your daughters' and sons' history books, or grandchildren's or whatever, something like, the women's rights movement began in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott held a convention. How many of you find that a familiar statement? And that is typically what's given as the start of the women's suffrage movement. At the beginning, I will just tell you now that in the pre-Civil War years, the terms women's rights and women's suffrage movement is somewhat used synonymously, and then it flips to the women's suffrage movement after the Civil War when that becomes the dominant focus. Of course, the 1848 Seneca Falls statement begs the question of what on earth had happened that led Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott to invite people to attend a convention, that they even thought of such a thing and thought that people might attend. Something had to happen that made women's rights be in the air that people were breathing in Seneca Falls, New York. And what had happened can be traced to Massachusetts and the emergence of the abolitionist or anti-slavery movement in the 1830s. And it really begins with William Lloyd Garrison, whose name you probably have heard. William Lloyd Garrison was from Newburyport, Massachusetts. He moved to Boston and in 1831 began a newspaper called The Liberator, which was dedicated to the total eradication of slavery from the United States. It was a very unpopular and small movement at the beginning. Slavery had ended in the North, or was ending in the North, but it was deeply embedded and very profitable, of course, in the South. So William Lloyd Garrison began this newspaper, and Garrison did more than just begin a newspaper. He invited blacks and whites and women as well as men to join him in the anti-slavery effort. And he encouraged people to organize anti-slavery societies, separate ones in that era for men and women, but nonetheless he also proposed and helped people start female anti-slavery societies. That was a very radical proposition in that era, since women in the 1830s in the United States were supposed to be confined to what was known as the domestic sphere, the sphere of home and hearth, taking care of the house, raising the children, and always being subservient to the man, who was, of course, the head of the household. Women had no legal rights. So Garrison simply proposing that women become involved in the abolitionist movement at all was really a radical departure from the domestic sphere. Women were not supposed to be involved in political issues at all. But Garrison did more than that, because a few years later, in the mid-1830s, he actually trained two women who were sisters to become anti-slavery lecturers. And he proposed that they join the men that had been trained in a similar fashion and go around and speak about the evils of slavery to audiences of women he thought the women would speak, and proposed them to become involved in the abolitionist movement. Now, the Grimke sisters were themselves very unusual women because they were actually not from the North, which was, of course, the center of the young abolitionist movement, but from the South. They grew up in this house in Charleston, South Carolina, from a very wealthy, prominent family in Charleston, South Carolina. And their family owned many slaves and also plantations. But Angelina and Sarah had made their way to Philadelphia. They became Quakers, and Quakers were among the very first people in this country opposed to slavery, since they thought it was immoral for another person to own another human's body. And so Sarah and Angelina Grimke joined a female anti-slavery society in Philadelphia, and through a letter Angelina wrote, got in touch with William Lloyd Garrison. So as I mentioned, he trained the two sisters to become anti-slavery spokespersons, and in the summer of 1837, with the help of some women abolitionists in Massachusetts, they organized a trip throughout Massachusetts during the summer of 1837, whereupon Angelina and Sarah were supposed to go from town to town and speak to audiences of women and encourage them to join anti-slavery societies and become abolitionists. Well, what happened was men began to come to their talks too. Men came for different reasons. Reports, Angelina did almost all of the speaking, and reports of Angelina's eloquence spread. People came to hear her speak. Lecturing was, of course, a popular form of entertainment in that era. Some came because they were interested in learning more about the abolitionist movement. Some came to make fun of a woman who was speaking. But whatever the reasons, men began to come too. And that upset conservatives in general, because women were doing this new activity. But it particularly upset the conservative Congregational ministers of Massachusetts, who at that point were very powerful. Many people in Massachusetts at that point still belonged to the Congregational church. And the Congregational ministers that summer issued a letter that they asked every Congregational minister to read from the pulpit one Sunday that condemned what the Grimke sisters were saying. And in part, the letter said that when a woman assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural, and the way is opened for degeneracy and ruin. Now, on the theory that a picture is worth 1,000 words, I thought I would illustrate to you what I think they meant by degeneracy and ruin. They meant something like this, that the home would be turned upside down, that a woman would be leaving, going in a coach driven by a woman with a woman footman, and there is her poor husband at home doing the mending, tending the baby, and a male servant over on the side is doing the laundry. So that's what they meant by degeneracy and ruin. And of course, the Congregational ministers expected the Grimke sisters and their female supporters, and their male supporters in the abolitionist movement, to sit down and be quiet. But I know you all know what comes next in the story. And of course, the Grimke sisters did no such thing. They continued to stand behind the podium, but they also picked up their pens. And they wrote a series of public letters defending a woman's rights to have position on political and public issues and to speak out about them. And these letters were published in the abolitionist press. Their letters are wonderful. They're online, and if you're interested, I really encourage you to look them up. But I pulled out a couple of my favorite quotes to share with you tonight. So Sarah, for her part in one of the letters, said that there are few things which present greater obstacles to the elevation of woman to her appropriate sphere, not the domestic sphere, but her appropriate sphere of usefulness and duty, than laws that destroy her independence and crush her individuality, laws which she has no voice in establishing. And Angelina, for her part, in 1837, wrote that I contend that woman has just as much right to sit in solemn council in conventions, conferences, associations, and general assemblies as man, just as much right to sit in the presidential chair of the United States. I mean, really remarkable woman. So this is what was going on in Massachusetts in the summer of 1837. And Angelina, in a letter, wrote to one of her friends in Philadelphia that everybody is consumed with discussion of the subject of woman. Well, along with the Grimke sisters, though they kind of disappear from the lead part of the story the following year when Angelina gets married, and she moves to New Jersey with her husband, who's also an abolitionist. Sarah, who never marries, moves with them. And they continue to write and speak out, but they're no longer leading spokespersons. Angelina has 3 children, and they actually open a boarding school to educate some of the children of abolitionists. So Abby Kelley Foster is the person who becomes the lead figure in terms of picking up the mantle. And Abby Kelley Foster developed what she used to refer to as her bloody feet, as she went near and far, preaching against slavery, lecturing against slavery, and also for the right of woman to have an opinion on political issues. And one of the places that Abby Kelley Foster went to speak, as did William Lloyd Garrison, was Oberlin College. Oberlin College was a new college opened in Ohio that was dedicated to educating women as well as men, and blacks as well as white. And that's very important for our story because Lucy Stone of Massachusetts was a student at Oberlin College. Lucy Stone was born in 1818 in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, which is part of Worcester County. Like many farm girls, she went to school till she was about 16 and then became a primary school teacher. But she was desperate to continue her education, and she worked as a teacher for a number of years while slowly saving enough money to attend college. And she ultimately traveled to Oberlin College, where she graduated in 1847. And so she graduated at 29 years old. While she was at Oberlin College, she had the opportunity to hear from spokespersons against slavery, including, as I just mentioned, William Lloyd Garrison and Abby Kelley Foster. And when Lucy Stone graduated in 1847, she became an anti-slavery lecturer. But she also broke new ground because she began to deliver separate lectures devoted to the subject of women's rights. Nobody had yet done that. The lectures about women's rights were always folded into lectures about the anti-slavery movement. But Lucy Stone began to also deliver separate letters devoted solely to the subject of women's rights. And this was, as I said, in 1847. So now you understand, of course, Seneca Falls and why there was a new spirit in the air in 1848. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton had actually lived in Boston for a number of years and was familiar with the Boston abolitionist movement before she and her husband had moved to upstate New York. So now we're going to talk about how we move in the women's rights movement from orators to organizers. So far we've been talking about oration and writing, but how do we get to an organized movement? And I argue in my book that the organized women's suffrage movement was also really formed in Massachusetts in Worcester in 1850. So let me explain that. The Seneca Falls Convention, of course, did take place in 1848 at this chapel that has been rebuilt up there. You can go and visit it. It's fascinating. And 300 people attended a conference that was called with 10 days' notice by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott's sister, who also lived in Seneca Falls, and 2 other Quaker women. And they invited people to come to this convention. And amazingly, with only 10 days' notice, 300 people came, mostly women, but some men, and also very prominently Frederick Douglass, who was a new voice on the abolitionist scene. He was a recently, as you all know, self-emancipated slave from Virginia. Prior to the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, whereupon using the U.S. Declaration of Independence as a model, she crafted a document criticizing all the laws and rules that suppressed women and making a claim for women's rights. And so that happened in 1848. It was very important. It was the first time this ever happened, but there was no follow-up. It was a one-shot effort. And that was very much on Elizabeth Cady Stanton's mind. And in fact, a couple of months later, she wrote a letter to one of her friends, an abolitionist friend, and she said, "Do you not think we ought to have a lecturer to travel all over the country and lecture on this subject of women's rights? Lucy Stone, I think, might be engaged for this purpose." So I tell you that for several reasons. One is it points out, of course, Lucy's fame already in 1848, but also that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was very aware that there wasn't a follow-up effort plan and was eager to have one. Now, it never happened that Lucy Stone became a lecturer then, but what did happen instead is that Lucy Stone, Abby Kelley Foster, and other of their colleagues in the abolitionist movement decided in 1850 that they would call together the first ever national women's rights convention. Now, national, of course, in that era meant northern. People in the South that were busy defending the institution of slavery and keeping slaves in their place had no interest whatsoever in women's rights. So by a national rights convention, they meant a northern convention. They gave 6 months' notice so that the word could spread near and far and people could come from all over, they hoped. And very importantly, they called it the first National Women's Rights Convention because they already had a plan that there would be annual conventions, so that there would be follow-up, so that a movement could start to form. And this convention was held in October of 1850 in Worcester. Worcester was chosen for a couple of reasons. It was, of course, the home county of both Abby Kelley Foster and Lucy Stone. It was also a thriving manufacturing and reformist city in that era, and it was a major transportation crossroads, north, south, and east, west. So it was considered a really favorable geographic location. And the people who came, over 1,000 women and some men came from 11 northern states. Most of the ones who came were similar in profile to Lucy Stone. They were largely white, literate, native-born, and Protestant. But there were already a few exceptions even in that early era, most particularly Sojourner Truth, a self-emancipated slave from New York when New York still had slavery, came. She did not give her famous Ain't I a Woman speech there. That came the following year in Ohio, but she was there. So I point that out to show you that there's a little bit of diversity in the movement from the beginning, but that this movement at the outset was very much a white movement, and it will largely remain predominantly so throughout. Well, the 1850s had, just as Lucy Stone had hoped, a series of conventions. Conventions were held nearly every single year during the 1850s. The movement, the women's rights movement, was still small, but it grew. You can see the conventions. The second one was also held in Worcester. Then they had some in New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Susan B. Anthony emerges on the scene in 1852 when she attends the Syracuse Convention. She was she was born in Massachusetts, as you may know, in Adams, but then her family moved to upstate New York, and she was raised in Rochester, New York. And when she attends the convention in 1852, she decides to dedicate the rest of her life to the cause of women's rights. And during the 1850s, it was really Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who emerged as the trio that were the heads of this young movement. Now, of course, one of the complicated things about the women's suffrage movement is that it's very long, 80 years, and you can't isolate it from the rest of US history. So many other things are happening underneath it. And of course, the 1850s is also the decade that brought this nation to the eve of, and then the beginning in 1861, of civil war over the issue of slavery, the institution of slavery in the South. So what happened during the war, and again, I'm going to be brief with most of my remarks, the leaders decided that they had to suspend their movement during the Civil War and devote their efforts to supporting the Union war effort. However, even though they did so, women gained many new skills during the Civil War that would become very important after the war. So women, for example, became nurses. They managed homes and farms and businesses while their husbands, fathers, sons, brothers were away fighting. And women formed what were called sanitary societies, which were societies that both gathered and sewed, knitted, provisions for men in the field and men who were ill and injured at hospitals. And that was very important also because it brought women together out of the home, and also the women who organized this effort and handled the shipments and so forth. This is really the precursor to women's organizations, women's clubs, for example, that would emerge after the Civil War and be very, very important. So women gained all sorts of new skills, as has historically been the case in this country during wartime. As to our three key leaders, Stone, Anthony, and Stanton, they worked very hard with the abolitionist community in trying to persuade Abraham Lincoln to first support an Emancipation Proclamation and then a 13th Amendment to end slavery. So the war ends in 1865. Now what? And the answer was a schism developed in this young women's rights movement that would pit Lucy Stone on the one hand against Anthony and Stanton on the other. And the cause of it was the issue of universal suffrage after the Civil War. So during the Civil War, it had become clear that the next battlefield after the war, if the North prevailed, was going to be the ballot. And Frederick Douglass, for example, had become a very prominent spokesperson about the importance of the ballot for newly freed slaves. That the only way in our country, he said, one can protect rights and keep rights is to have the vote. Well, the women abolitionists like Stone, Stanton, and Anthony all supported that, but what they wanted was universal suffrage. Suffrage for black men, but also suffrage for all women. And that's what they expected the abolitionist community to do after the Civil War. After all, they had been such good members of the abolitionist community. And they felt that it was only reasonable and that everybody would see it that way. But that isn't what happened. Instead, the Republicans, the radical Republicans who still controlled Congress for a brief moment of time after the Civil War, decided to support only suffrage for black men, not suffrage for women also. And there were several reasons for that, but the most important were this, that there has always been in this country, or was always, an association between bullets and ballots. That if you're willing and able to take a bullet, that should put you at the front of the line in the quest for the ballot. And of course, once black men were able to enlist and fight for the Union Army, they took many, many bullets and fought with great valor. So they were deemed somehow as more worthy of receiving the ballot than women. Another reason was that the Republicans in Congress, who very much, of course, were thinking about the future of elections once the country was united and the Confederate States came back into the nation, they knew that black men were almost certainly to vote for the Republican Party. That was the Abolitionist Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln. They were skeptical of how women as a group would vote, and they thought it was most likely that women would vote the same way as their husbands voted, and that their votes would reflect the diverse affiliations across the country. So they didn't think it was necessarily politically helpful to them, and they thought it might be politically unhelpful because it would mean pushing what they call two radical agenda items at once. So they decided to support a 15th Amendment that would give the vote to black men and leave women out, and they promised that once the 15th Amendment were ratified, then they would support the women's effort to gain the vote. Well, that led to a very bitter schism in 1869. Lucy Stone was very, very sad about the fact that the 15th Amendment left women out, but she nonetheless pledged to support it. And she said that woman has an ocean of wrongs too deep for any plummet, and the Negro too has an ocean of wrongs that cannot be fathomed. I will be thankful in my soul if anybody can get out of this terrible pit. Stanton and Anthony, for their part, refused to support the 15th Amendment, and they refused in very racist terms. I didn't want to put up on a slide for public consumption some of the most racist comments they made, but they are in my book. So I left it at a statement of Stanton that gets the point across, which is, I will not support men of other races making laws for the daughters of Jefferson, Hancock, and Adams. And this dispute over whether or not to support the 15th Amendment led to a schism, as I mentioned. These, of course, were women of iron constitutions, very strong wills, and they now went from being wonderful friends to being bitter rivals. The 15th Amendment was, in fact, as you all know, adopted into the Constitution. And as a result of the schism, two competing rival suffrage organizations were formed. Anthony and Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was based in New York, to pursue a federal amendment, and they began a short-lived newspaper that published for a couple of years. Lucy Stone began the Boston-based American Women's Suffrage Association, which would actually be the more active and vital suffrage organization over the next 20 years. She began a journal called the Women's Journal that was published every single week through 1920. She was inclusive. She invited blacks and men to join the American Women's Suffrage Association, and she too wanted a federal amendment. But she was much more realistic about the strategy that was and the tactics necessary to try to obtain it. She said, we can't just go to Congress and say, please do this. What we need to do is try to win in some of the states, get states to amend their constitutions to allow women to vote. And once we have a critical mass of senators and congressmen beholden to women voters, then they'll support a women's suffrage amendment. And her strategy turned out to be, as we'll talk about, the one that worked. So if you are listening, and I hope you are sitting there asking yourselves a question like this. If everything that Barbara has said is true, why don't I know this? Why haven't I always known about Lucy Stone, the Worcester Convention, the Women's Journal, the American Women's Suffrage Association? And the answer in brief, of course, is that history is not necessarily what happened. History is the story we are told about what happened. And during the 20 years of schism, undoubtedly the most important thing that Anthony and Stanton did was write the first 2 volumes of what would become ultimately a 6-volume work called History of Women's Suffrage. They wrote a one-sided version of their role in the movement. That's when they elevated Seneca Falls to the birth story of the suffrage movement. And they really largely erased Lucy Stone and her wing from the history of the movement. And it's really only in the last 10 to 15 years that historians have really fully exposed this. There was a wonderful book written a number of years ago called The Myth of Seneca Falls, in which the author, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon, in great detail goes through exactly how it was that Stanton and Anthony went from agreeing that the birth of the women's suffrage movement was the Worcester Convention of 1850 to dismissing that event and instead elevating the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Which, as I said, was certainly an important event, but it wasn't the birth of an organized movement. As for our Massachusetts-based organization, what was it doing during those 20 years? And in brief, first of all, their offices were right on Park Street, just steps from the State House. Julia Ward Howe, who had become very famous during the Civil War when she penned the lyrics to Battle Hymn of the Republic, became the organizer of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. So the first thing the American Women's Suffrage Association wanted to do was to help organize state suffrage associations and then have those state suffrage associations organize local suffrage associations. And I wish, for example, I had had time to research Wellesley before I came tonight, and I didn't. But if some of you have done it or do have time, I think it's very likely that you will find that there was a Wellesley Equal Suffrage League or some similarly named organization started in Wellesley at some point between 1870 and 1890. That certainly was true of Dedham, for example, and it was certainly true of Newton, where I live. May or may not have been true in Wellesley, but there's certainly a reasonable likelihood. So what they did was form these associations and have women begin to campaign for the vote. This is the home where Lucy Stone lived in Dorchester with her husband Henry Blackwell and her daughter Alice Stone Blackwell, who will become important in a few minutes. The Women's Journal is this wonderful, wonderful newspaper, which you can read online, that was published, as I said, every single week for 50 years, and it was critically important. Not only did it share news about the suffrage movement, it also publicized women's accomplishments in every other sphere. Every time a women's college opened, they wrote about it. Every time a woman composed a piece that was played by an orchestra, they wrote about it. And in the early years, before telephone and so forth, it was actually a communications vehicle also. where leagues could update each other about what was happening. I mentioned that Lucy Stone welcomed blacks and men to the American Woman Suffrage Association. Probably the most important local African-American woman was Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who was a member of both the American Woman Suffrage Association and the Massachusetts Woman Suffrage Association, and also organized a club of black women called the Women's Era Club. She started a newspaper, also, as you can see, and she actually called together in 1895 the first ever gathering of black women's clubs, and that was the precursor to what becomes the National Association of Colored Women and other organizations. I told you about the state strategy. So the American Woman Suffrage Association focused on organizing state associations, as I said, and state campaigns. And it trained people and sent them all over the place to help with state campaigns. And it was a brilliant strategy because, among other things, one of the things that happened is that even though suffrage had been born in the abolitionist turmoil in the Northeast, it actually took root in the far west of the country. And the first states that enfranchised women, in other words, that passed constitutional amendments to their state constitution to enfranchise women, were the 4 western states of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. It's complicated why these particular states, but the general answer is not complicated. It's that these states did not have the conservative institutions and traditions of places in the Northeast. They didn't have colleges like Harvard. They didn't have banks. They didn't have Gilded Age robber barons. They had pioneers, adventurers, a great respect for the individual. They encouraged women to come, and women really worked as equal partners in so many ways in the West. So it's really no accident that it took root in the soil of the West. So how about poor old Massachusetts, where, of course, Lucy Stone had hoped that Massachusetts would quickly enfranchise women. After all, it had had so many abolitionists, and become the poster child for success in the Northeast. That didn't happen because there were huge changes after the Civil War. The country went from focusing on abolitionism and then war to focusing on fortunes. It was the era of the Gilded Age. So Massachusetts changed tremendously demographically. There were many new immigrant groups. The Irish had begun coming in great numbers even before the Civil War, and that continued, of course, after the war. Also, Italians, Germans, Russians, Eastern European Jews, and so forth flocked to this country and went to work, many of them in factories. They joined the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was at that point the party that was welcoming to immigrants and also the party of the working class. They had no interest in the women's suffrage movement because the women's suffrage movement was viewed as allied with the Republican Party from its historical roots in the Republican Party when the Republican Party was an abolitionist party. Also, of course, many of these immigrant groups were patriarchal from traditional societies and separately were not interested in the cause of women's rights. So that was a problem. And then the Republicans went from being the reformist party of abolitionism to becoming the party of big business. And they had no interest in women's suffrage in a state like Massachusetts because, among other things, they feared that if women could vote, women might be sympathetic to the plight of working men and women and children in factories. So and there was also a new conservatism during the Gilded Age and after the Civil War. So cartoons like this, which is a slightly more modern version of the one you saw earlier, were very popular, again indicating the risk to men, to their place in society, their place at home, if women had the vote. It wasn't just that women would leave for 15 minutes a year or 30 minutes a year and go cast a vote. It's what it meant about who was in control of society and who was in control at home. The United States Supreme Court, for its part, weighed in 1873, reminding people that the domestic sphere is that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. And that statement was actually made in a state that denied a woman a law license. Lucy Stone and her allies in Massachusetts were ever inventive. And they said, okay, if we can't win and get the state to let us all vote here, let's try to get partial suffrage. Let's get our foot in the door. And once we have our foot in the door, we can open it a bit wider, and then eventually we'll get the vote. And so the first thing that happened was that women received the vote for school committee. That was actually something pursued by women's clubs, really not the American Woman Suffrage Association. They weren't sure that they wanted something as limited as that. But then when it began to happen, they supported it. And women in Massachusetts actually gained the right to vote for school committee in 1879, which makes perfect sense, of course, because women were always charged with raising and educating children. So then they hoped that once they had school committee suffrage, that they would be able to gain suffrage in city and town elections, which didn't require a constitutional amendment, but just a simple majority in the legislature. And they argued, they used cartoons like this one, "From force of habit, she will clean it up." In other words, they tried to play on their traditional role. You know, who better than woman to make sure we have clean water, safe food, safe streets, playgrounds, and so forth. But their success seemed potentially likely, and that led the anti-suffragists to organize. And the anti-suffragists were composed of men and women, but women became most visible, but they were backed by their husbands, fathers, and so forth. It was the sort of Boston Brahmin society, the very wealthy elite who didn't want change and was willing to pour a lot of money into preventing change. And what happened in 1895 is the legislature decided to put the question to voters. And they asked the voters of Massachusetts, would you like us to extend suffrage for women to city and town elections? And they allowed men to vote, and they allowed women who were registered to vote for school committee to vote. And men overwhelmingly defeated it. Of the women who voted, 96% favored it, but men overwhelmingly defeated it. That was in 1895. And also, the following year, there was a defeat in the West in 1896 in California. And so that meant that the mid-1890s were a real low point in the suffrage struggle. And it was clear that there would need to be new strategies, new tactics, a new figuring out of what to do. And happily, things were well poised for that to happen, because a few years earlier, actually in 1890, Alice Stone Blackwell and some other younger woman of the second generation said to their mothers and elders, Stone, Stanton, and Anthony, and their close allies, younger women do not understand why there are two suffrage organizations. The 15th Amendment passed 20 years ago. Our movement is small and struggling, and you need to reunite. And she and the other younger woman were able to persuade the now much older Stone, Stanton, and Anthony to reconcile and form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. But Lucy Stone never really gets to enjoy the fruits of that because she dies of cancer just a few years later. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who really never cared for organizing, went off to England to live with her daughter for a number of years. And it was Anthony who takes the helm as the leader of the new National American Woman Suffrage Association and runs it from 1890 to 1900 when she retires. And she lives until 1906. The other thing that happened, and again, we talked briefly about the Gilded Age, now happily we get to turn to the Progressive Era, that era that begins in around 1895, 1900, a reformist era of American history. There were new social currents. And a lot of it was that many people across the board recognized that the country had to come together and address certain problems. It had to address issues of overcrowded cities, poverty, unsafe factories, child labor, government corruption, and so forth. It was also an era when many new schools in the late 19th century had opened for women. More women were becoming educated. There were new opportunities, and so forth. So women were facing, well, it was a different place for women. The telephone had been invented, and women now worked as telephone operators. There were department stores where women could shop and also have jobs. Many women, as I said, went to college. Well, not that many. Many women went to high school, and a number of women were able to go to college. So things were changing on the ground in terms of women's lives. And at that point, a new leader took over the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1900, when the 80-year-old Susan B. Anthony stepped down. And that was Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a great organizer. She retained the state focus of Lucy Stone and the American Woman Suffrage Association, but unfortunately, she also really continued the legacy of racism from the National Woman Suffrage Association. Carrie Chapman Catt recognized that ultimately to succeed, a women's suffrage amendment was going to have to be supported by some Southern congressmen and some Southern senators. And so she really did not want to take on the issue of race. So Black women really continued to largely be excluded, not completely, but in a lot of ways from the women's suffrage movement as it continued into the 20th century. Carrie Chapman Catt had some wonderful allies. I can only mention a few of them, but I'll just give you a few high-level favorites. Maud Park, who went to Radcliffe, graduated in 1898, and she was very disappointed that a lot of women as privileged as she, who had a chance to attend schools like Radcliffe and Wellesley and so forth, were apathetic about women's suffrage. And so she and a friend began the College Equal Suffrage League in Massachusetts to try to involve college students and alums in the women's suffrage movement. And she did that so successfully that she was ultimately asked by Carrie Chapman Catt to do it nationally. She traveled all over the country organizing college equal suffrage leagues. Another very important woman was Florence Luscomb. She was very active in piloting open air meetings, a new 20th century strategy. And what that basically would mean is, if you take tonight, instead of my speaking to all of you, an audience who chose to come and learn about the history, maybe instead I should have gone to the Wellesley Town Center or the Wellesley Town Green and just stood outside and spoke, and maybe nobody would listen at first, but eventually maybe a few people would come, and they would likely be people who knew nothing about the suffrage movement and who might be converted back then. So Florence Luscomb believed that you should take the movement out of the parlor and into the streets. And as a result of all these things, and of course I can't go into all the details, and this is my favorite cartoon in my book. This wonderful artist in 1911 in a New York newspaper talked about how the type had changed. And suffragists had been portrayed for decades in the popular press like the figure on the left, you know, unattractive, masculinized, spinster-looking woman. And now, due to Maud Park and these other young, energetic women, the movement was more fashionable. And the statement on the right is actually written by a friend of Maud Park's. Maud Park is off traveling, and this friend from Massachusetts writes to her about the incredible changes that have happened. This is in 1909 when she writes the letter, and says that the movement, which when we got into it had about as much energy as a dying kitten, is now actually fashionable. That was critical. It also starts to become a more diverse movement. It also becomes a more wealthy movement, but I'm going to save that for the Q&A, just keeping an eye on time, so you can ask about that. It still is largely a white movement, but it stops being as much of a native-born Protestant movement. And finally, alliances are built with various groups of immigrant women, which are very important, because through those women, they could access some of those men, and in particular, the support of very important male labor unions. Mary Kenney O'Sullivan was probably the most critical figure. She was not from Massachusetts, but she moved here. And here in Massachusetts, she founded the Women's Trade Union League. And she both helped to organize and convince wage-earning women to support women's suffrage. And as I said, she also helped support from labor unions of men. Margaret Foley was another important Irish Catholic in Boston who engaged in, she would have loved social media, all sorts of high-profile tactics to bring attention to the movement. And in the picture I have here, she is about to go up in a hot air balloon at a county fair with her Votes for Women pennant. I mean, the women did all sorts of things. They went to Nantasket Beach and put out, a big banner saying "Votes for Women" on the beach. And when they were told that they couldn't do it on the beach, they walked into the water up to their ankles and did it in the water. Jennie Loitman Barron was probably the most active Jewish suffragist. She founded the BU Equal Suffrage League, and she became a leader in the open-air outside movement. And as a result of all this new energy, there were finally a whole bunch of new victories. Lots more states enfranchised women, but of course, none of these states is in the Northeast. These, again, are all in the West. The only one that's heading somewhat east is Illinois. So the question was, could now the suffragists get this momentum from the West, the country looked like this, to come east? So the yellow states had enfranchised women. And in 1915, 4 very important Northeastern states, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, all considered amendments to their state constitution to enfranchise women. And there were similar campaigns in each of these 4 states. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures from the Massachusetts campaign. First thing, very importantly, is cars are now on the scene. So we had suffragists driving around the countryside, going to factories, going to town greens. They still made use of trolleys and so forth, but significantly they also used cars. It's just another picture. They made tchotchkes, like this Votes for Women, a bluebird. 100,000 of them were plastered around the state. They created favors to call attention to the women's suffrage movement at different things. The one on the left is a fan that says, "While watching the horse race, don't forget one half the human race." They had major parades. There were 2 huge state parades in Boston, but there were also smaller parades all over the state. And again, I bet you could find that Wellesley might have created floats for some of these various parades. But the anti-suffragists had not gone away either. They were out campaigning vigorously against the amendment that would extend the right to women, arguing that it was dangerous to the way things had always been, and in particular, dangerous to the family. And this cartoon, of course, depicts what might happen to a woman who gains the right to vote. Once she has suffrage, the steps that she's now on are strife, anxiety, and loneliness. And her poor little children are down at the bottom, forlorn. So what happened in 1915 when this came to a vote? Did the voters of Massachusetts enfranchise women, the male voters? Anybody? No is right. There was a defeat in all 4 of those states, but the largest margin of defeat was in Massachusetts because Massachusetts continued to have the largest and strongest anti-suffrage association. So, knowing that in 1915 and that this victory 5 years later, how did that happen? That really should be the subject of a whole separate talk because so much happened in the next 5 years. But I will just give you the barest outlines, and then I hope we can talk about it more or you can read about it more. There were several different strands that came into play. The first was that Carrie, Chapman, Catt, after the defeat in 1915, said, "It is time to end the state strategy. We have now basically won all the Western states. The South is not going to enfranchise women, and we've had these terrible defeats in the Northeast. It is now time for us to lobby congressmen and senators with the help of the support we have from those from the Western states." And Maud Wood Park, the same woman who founded the College Equal Suffrage League, was brought to Washington to become Carrie Chapman Catt's lead lobbyist. There was a whole major lobbying operation, and women of means would travel in from different states and lobby their individual congressmen and senators. But Maud Wood Park was the head of the whole effort. Some of the younger suffragists were very frustrated by Carrie Chapman Catt and Maud Wood Park at this point. They thought they were too polite and too slow, and they wanted, as they put it, deeds, not words. And that was led by Alice Paul, a name some of you may know. She founded there was another schism, and about 5% of young women broke away from the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and they formed something called the National Woman's Party. They modeled themselves on a more militant suffrage movement that was going on in England at the time. Alice Paul had spent some time in England and had been arrested and actually force-fed when she was imprisoned in England. And she came back and brought those tactics back to the United States. And her deeds, not words movement led to things like picketing in front of the White House. And that brought a wave of mostly negative publicity to the suffrage movement, but it still brought publicity. And publicity, of course, was important. Then some sympathy came when many of these women who were picketing were arrested. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners. And when they were not treated as political prisoners, they went on hunger strikes, the same tactic that had been used in England. And they were force-fed, which is really a torturous proceeding. And that brought waves of revulsion and more sympathy to the women suffragists also. And then, of course, we have World War I, which affected the suffrage movement in 2 ways. The first is that Woodrow Wilson, when he entered the war in 1917, pledged that the United States was joining what had been up until then a European war to make the world safe for democracy. And meanwhile, directly as a result of the war, a number of European nations were either enfranchising women, like the Russians did after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, or moving toward it. For instance, England partially enfranchised women in 1918. So the argument to Woodrow Wilson that you can't claim that you're going to be a leader moving the world to democracy without enfranchising women, he had always opposed suffrage, but he began to listen. And then World War I, just like the Civil War, brought all sorts of new and expanded roles for women. And Carrie Chapman Catt, for her part, she had actually been a pacifist and opposed the U.S. entering the war. But when the U.S. did, she urged all the members of the National American Women's Suffrage League to support the war fully so that people would see that the women were full partners in the war effort. And as a result of these different things, Wilson finally endorsed the 19th Amendment. It came before the House of Representatives that passed it, and it was defeated in the Senate by 2 votes in October of 1918. So now what? Of course, the answer was that you had to somehow flip 2 senators. This is in October 19, which means an election is only 1 month later. So how do you do that? You have to identify senators who are up for election, and of course only 1/3 of the Senate is up at any 2-year time, and you have to identify senators whose opponent would support women's suffrage. It made no sense to try to defeat a senator, say in the South, if the opponent was also going to oppose women's suffrage. But there were 2 senators who had opponents, one in Delaware and one in Massachusetts, that supported women's suffrage. And so the Massachusetts campaigners from 1915 turned their on switch back on and organized a campaign very, very quickly against a man named Senator John W. Weeks, who was a former mayor of Newton, very conservative. And they organized a very strategic campaign. They didn't attack him for opposing women's suffrage. They knew that after the defeat in 1915, that wasn't going to be a win. What they did instead is they did really what we would call today opposition research. They sent one of their women, Teresa Crowley, who actually was a lawyer, to Washington, D.C. She researched his record, and they put together ads like this, showing all the progressive legislation that was favored by many Massachusetts voters that Weeks had opposed. And they ran this brilliant, concentrated campaign. Weeks was defeated, as was the senator from Delaware. That paved the way for Congress to finally pass the 19th Amendment or propose it, and for the states to ratify it. That, of course, was a whole separate process that culminated with Tennessee ratifying it in August 2020. And lo and behold, after an 80-year struggle, the women of this nation finally had the vote. And just to end for a moment, where I started, which is my question of what happened to the wonderful National American Women's Suffrage Association after the 19th Amendment, you all know the answer. Became the League of Women Voters, and Carrie Chapman Catt was the first honorary president, and Maud Wood Park was the first national president. This wouldn't be an American history lecture, of course, or talk, if you didn't also point out the things that didn't happen. I mean, there's never such a thing as a perfect success. So it was, of course, a great, wonderful victory, but it was also an imperfect victory in a couple of different ways. No sooner were Black women enfranchised under the 19th Amendment than their right to vote was immediately stripped in the South, just of course as the voting rights of Black men had been stripped. The same Jim Crow laws that stripped the right to vote for Black men was applied to Black women. So Black women who were enfranchised technically never were really able to vote in the South until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Secondly, the 19th Amendment was read narrowly. Most states did not give any other rights to women. So in Massachusetts, for instance, women tried to argue, if we can vote, that makes us citizens, and therefore you have to let us sit on juries because that's another fundamental obligation and duty of citizens. But the Supreme Judicial Court, where I work, said no, and women in Massachusetts actually did not get to sit on juries until 1950, which is really remarkable. And then, of course, all the other inequalities in our society remained in 1920, some of which still remain today. So it was not a perfect victory, but nonetheless, it was a great, enormous, wonderful victory. And of course, it ensured, thanks to these wonderful, heroic women, that all women in this country have the ballot, which is, of course, the most important tool in our democratic toolbox. So I am going to stop. I know I covered a lot, but I wanted to give you an overview. And I would love to hear not only questions about this or anything, I mean, usually I get questions about the Equal Rights Amendment, so don't be shy. But I would also love to hear your own stories, if any of you have them and you would like to share them. So thank you. So questions or comments, and I know this is being filmed, so I'll do my best to repeat them. That's wonderful. Was she in Massachusetts?
No,
New York. Well, you know, New York had a very, very active campaign, and one thing I didn't get to mention today is that even though New York defeated suffrage in 1915 like Massachusetts, it actually did enfranchise its women in 1917. So it actually tried again and succeeded then. That's fabulous. Does your grandmother have, is this all oral history, or were there letters and pictures too? That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, no, it sounds it. Yes, many of these women, you know, a disproportionate number of suffragists were single, but of course most of them were married, and many of them did have supportive husbands. I mean, there were a lot of men. I mean, ultimately, remember, even though we're talking about the woman, and the men supporter of the suffrage movement really tried to stay in the background so that women were the face of the movement. But of course, ultimately, it was male votes that were critical. And so Lucy Stone's strategy, again from the outset, of welcoming men into the movement, encouraging them, was also critical. I mean, suffrage could not have happened without ultimately the support of enough men. Other questions, comments? Yes?
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, I had heard, and I don't know if this is true, that the women were given the right to vote in the Western territories more as a strategy because they needed votes to prove that they were a populous area, and so it was more strategy than that they were more liberated. I didn't know if that's true.
That's partially true. I mean, when I mentioned the West and I said I was giving you the broadest overview, I mean, every single territory and every single Western state has its own unique story. And so there were different political considerations in every one, and everyone, it's just like telling the story of Massachusetts. Everyone's is different. So that is, what you say is true in that regard, but it's also true that on balance, there was a desire to get more women out there, and they didn't have these conservative, influential institutions. I mean, these were brand new societies. So it was a confluence. And there's a wonderful book, I forget the name of the author, about the victories in the West, and where she really devotes a chapter to each of the initial states and really looks deeply at the particular political constellation that was going on. And yes, I'm sure in some cases there was a need to, they wanted more women clearly to come because they had to be big enough to achieve statehood. And so that undoubtedly one of the strategies was to tell women if they came, they would have a better life and they would have more rights. Did you have a, sorry, did you have a second question?
Well, I'm just curious. I'm very curious to know, do you know, like, in terms of the evolution of the women's rights movement in England, it was more militant there. Do you know why? Like, why was the strength different?
Yes. So the English movement began, I mean, there was a lot of cross pond, so to speak, you know, cross Atlantic Ocean back and forth in terms of sharing ideas and so forth. And one thing that really helped the movement was when some of the English leaders came to the United States and went on public tours and gave speeches and so forth, and that brought a lot more energy. The English movement began similarly to the United States movement in that it was a pretty moderate movement. And then the Pankhurst family, the mother and two daughters, became the leaders of a more militant suffragette, is what it was called, wing. And they did things like chain themselves to fences, and ultimately they were committed to only property damage, no human damage, but they did do things like put bombs into mailboxes and so forth quite briefly. And the reason they did that, as they said, because they were unable to get government officials to even meet with them, that they were given, you know, no access, no ability. And when the Pankhursts were first coming to this country, and many people were critical of the tactics they had used, Alice Stone Blackwell, who took over the Women's Journal after her mother, Lucy Stone, had died, Alice writes in the Women's Journal that the tactics that they use in England are defensible there because of what they were facing. And we don't need to use those tactics here, nor would we endorse them, because even if we haven't yet got the vote, public officials are willing to meet with us and talk to us and so forth. But it was that movement that Alice Paul had joined when she had gone to England. And so she came back committed to that. It was also one other just quick thing about that movement is that because England has a parliamentary system, the militant wing in England was always against the party in power. And Alice Paul brought that tactic back here. And that was another reason for her frustration with Carrie, Chapman, Catt, with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Partly she said they weren't militant enough, but she also wanted to oppose the party in power, that same system. And Carrie, Chapman, Catt said, that's not our strategy. We don't care if somebody's a Democrat, a Republican, a member of the Prohibition Party. If they support women's suffrage, we support them. And so that was another reason for the divide. Yes, Marlena? Oh.
I had one other thought on why things happened earlier in the West, and there were women, the women had access to property through the Homestead Act, and many women took advantage of that so they'd be able to get, 160 acres at a shot. And once they became landowners, many feel comfortable associating land ownership with voting, and so on.
It really was a much more progressive place for women to live by and large. Other questions, comments, personal thoughts about the present? One of the things that people often ask about or we often talk about are sort of lessons learned. Because, of course, there are many lessons to be learned from the suffrage movement, but, of course, some of the same battles have never really gone away. I mean, some of the same issues about what is a woman's role in society and so forth, are very much with us. So it's really, it's amazing that 100 years later, so many things have changed, of course, and yet there is a certain repetition of some of the same issues and some of the same concerns. But all right, I would love, if any of you want to stay and ask questions, please feel free. I do have my book over there. It's $22, and I would love for you to take a look at it. And I can take cash, checks, or credit card. You've been a great audience, and thank you so much.